Hello everyone. The focus of this presentation is going to be on sensory modulation and its application to trauma-informed care. So my name is Jenna Steckschulte. I am an occupational therapy student from Kettering College. That's in Dayton, Ohio. I graduated from Ohio State in 2017 with a bachelor's degree in human development and family science. And I'll be graduating from Kettering at the end of April with my clinical doctorate in occupational therapy. So one of our final program requirements is to create a capstone project with a traditional or non-traditional practice setting. As I have previous education in family systems and a current interest in mental health, I found the population at Buckeye Ranch to be particularly interesting. After reaching out to Dr. Pam Scott, it was determined that while there's not currently an occupational therapist on staff at Buckeye Ranch, there is a desire there for education on sensory modulation from an occupational therapy perspective. So over the past 12 weeks, kind of since the beginning of January, I've been working with the RIFSP team, observing sessions on both residential campus and in community settings, and working to create an educational training module on sensory modulation principles and how they may apply to Buckeye Ranch's treatment population. As many of you know, prior to the spread of COVID-19, this training was intended to take place in person. However, due to our social distancing limitations, that's obviously no longer possible. But I still wanted to find a way to provide this content and education to you all. Therefore, I have created this presentation in a virtual manner and tried to incorporate as much information, videos, and interactive learning content as possible. So with that being said, here are some objectives to align with this online educational module. 1. Participants will demonstrate an understanding of sensory modulation and how it applies to trauma-informed care. 2. Participants will identify sensory modulation styles when provided with examples, videos, and case studies. 3. Participants will demonstrate understanding of appropriate sensory-related supports to facilitate client regulation, participation in daily activities, and family system functioning. So before we start in, I like to start with this quote. It states, "The experience of being human is embedded in the sensory events of everyday life." I like this quote because it's very encompassing. If we think of our day, actually, if we just think about our morning routine from the second we wake up until the second we get to work, and think about how many sensory experiences occur just in that short amount of time, it helps us to understand how disruptions in these systems could have an impact on our entire day. So what is sensory processing? Well, I imagine most of you are aware of sensory processing and its concepts, as the topic has sort of blown up in past years. I'm also aware that you all are looking for some practical, applicable intervention strategies to use. However, I feel in order to educate you on how to educate your own clients and families, it's crucial that you have an accurate understanding of what sensory processing is from a theoretical and evidence-based perspective. So with that being said, in its most basic definition, sensory processing can be described as how we use the mechanism of how we feel to make sense of the world around us. We know that everyone processes sensation. What we must understand is that everyone processes sensation differently. For example, I heard this example used before of a pear. When asking someone to take a bite of a pear and describe what sensations they experience when eating a bite, they may use the words sweet, juicy, soft on your tongue, or grainy like sand to describe the texture. These words can tell a story about sensory processing. The idea that a pear's texture is grainy like sand is something we can all agree on is true about the pear. However, we determine if we like or if we can tolerate that sensation. That's not something we necessarily all agree on. Some people like pears for the uniqueness of their texture. Some could be indifferent about the texture. Some people might feel that it's mushy and disgusting. So while this experience of a pear describes mainly a tactile experience, it's true for the sensory systems, all of the sensory systems that we'll talk about here in a moment. So why is this topic important? Why is it important that we learn about sensory processing? When looking at statistics and who it all impacts, our recent studies reveal that sensory-related difficulties as an isolated deficit impact approximately 16% of children, which comes out to be about 1 in 6 children. Additionally, statistics show that up to 88% of children with already diagnosed disabilities report difficulty processing sensory input. Thus, we know that sensory differences are present on their own, however, they can be exacerbated by the presence of a disability. So, 88% is a relatively high percentage if you think about it. Obviously, in the past 20-ish years, sensory processing has become a topic with greater recognition and more research. However, these statistics further emphasize how important it is that we are aware of sensory processing's presence and the potential impact it may have on daily life and overall well being. A couple other small statistics worth mentioning are that boys are 3 times more likely to display sensory related difficulties, and also that because it's a recently recognized deficit, there are many adults living with sensory related difficulties that never have and may never receive a formal diagnosis. I think that that's something very important that we remember when thinking about families and parents of children. So we talked about how individuals with previously diagnosed disabilities, about 88% of them also display sensory related deficits. So some of those common coexisting diagnoses are autism, ADHD, anxiety, depression, and schizophrenia. So generally speaking, we most commonly associate sensory processing difficulties with autism spectrum disorder, and it is certainly the most common coexisting diagnosis. This is likely because sensory related behaviors are actually part of the diagnostic criteria for autism. However, it's important that we remember that the reverse is not true, meaning that most children with sensory related difficulties don't have autism. So it's important that we don't lump them together. We need to understand them differently. ADHD is another very common comorbid diagnosis. They're often mistaken for each other, as many of their symptoms or behaviors may present the same way. However, they are unique differences as they have very different neurological basis. And some other obvious coexisting diagnoses are anxiety, depression, and schizophrenia. As you all are very familiar with some of these psych diagnoses throughout the presentation, I challenge you to think of how they might align or interfere with our sensory processing systems. Research shows that sensory-related deficits can stem from both environmental and physiological determinants. Some of the identified risk factors for sensory deficits include prematurity, prenatal complications, maternal illness or stress, maternal use of medication, living with a single parent, lower socioeconomic status, and trauma. So, when initially researching this topic as a potential project for my capstone, this information specifically stuck out very boldly to me. And after observing at Buckeye Ranch my first several weeks, it became very apparent that many of these risk factors are present with your clients and families at times, not just singularly on their own, but for many of your clients, multiple or all of these could apply. So while we don't currently have any necessarily direct evidence linking any one of these traumatic or adverse life experiences to sensory processing deficits, we do have some general research and evidence showing that it contributes and further affirming that this is a topic that's very important for us all to understand. So now kind of looking at it from the other end, research shows that children with sensory processing deficits, that those deficits can impact their social participation, emotional regulation, disruptive behaviors, flexibility, lack of coping behaviors, and then eventually impacting their relationships into adulthood. I don't mean to sound redundant, but when reading that list, some of those light bulbs again are going off, thinking about how a child's sensory processing could potentially be contributing to many of the behaviors your clients are presenting with or how they're impacting their family system functioning. So we're going to take that information from the past couple slides and we're going to sidebar here and kind of talk about how sensory modulation impacts the family system as a whole. So research shows us that sensory-related deficits can cause increased parental stress and exhaustion due to the strain that it has on daily routines and activities. Without proper intervention, the behaviors associated with sensory modulation deficits can be confusing, difficult to manage, and they can be very frequently occurring. Further, it causes restrictions on the parent and family's social lives because the behaviors associated with sensory differences are often seen as socially unacceptable, such as outbursts, continuous movements and noises, and or unpredictable meltdowns. Parents may stop taking the child altogether to public places such as restaurants, vacations, other people's homes, etc. And unless they have access to alternative childcare, they must just have to keep the whole family at home. So you can see how this could have an impact on the parent's sense of competence and questioning their ability to adequately parent. From what I understand, this is also very common with many of the clients and families you all treat, and is crucial in the steps to repair the family system as a whole. Within the development of my capstone project and my time here at Buckeye Ranch, I really wanted to further my own understanding and kind of look at how trauma and some of the neurosequential systems can impact or contribute to cycles of intergenerational trauma. So initially we were going to have Dr. Scott present on NMT within this presentation to tie in some interdisciplinary concepts. However, as that's obviously not feasible at this time, I've looked into a lot of the research surrounding NMT, and while I don't feel competent enough to provide a whole presentation on it, I do know that Bruce Perry's NMT theory supports that trauma impacts the healthy sequential development of the brain, and that also that research shows that some of our systems it can negatively impact are the primitive systems such as arousal, attachment, and some sensory systems, all the way up to our higher level cortex thinking such as modulation, reactivity, and insight. So specifically, I'm going to focus on how trauma impacts the development of these sensory modulation processes and attachment. So because of the extensive research behind Perry's neurosequential model of therapeutics, that trauma experienced early in life can impact attachment and sensory processes, I kind of wanted to start to build a visual of how trauma can impact all these systems and then lead to intergenerational trauma. So here's kind of the first steps. Trauma experienced early in life could impact either sensory modulation or attachment. Next, I looked deeper into how trauma and sensory modulation can impact the relationships within our family system and into adulthood. Through Bowlby's attachment theory and current research, we know that the tactile, visual, and auditory systems are the primary means of communication between a child and caregiver related to the caregiver's ability to meet their needs and provide soothing or regulation. This contributes to forming secure attachment. We also know that when those needs do not get met with the use of those three sensory systems, due to many possible reasons such as neglect, lack of resources, or lack of parental emotional availability, it can lead to insecure attachment. Because we know that sensory systems are involved in forming secure attachment, recent researchers have kind of looked into that relationship between the two. So now we have emerging research that was studying the relationship that shows that there is a significant correlation between sensory modulation and attachment. Further, they have found that sensory modulation and attachment are actually predictive systems, meaning that if a child has atypical responses to sensory information, they may also have difficulty forming healthy attachment to their primary caregivers. Or, on the other hand, a child who is insecurely attached to their caregiver may also struggle with correctly interpreting and responding to sensory stimuli from the environment. One example I read that kind of ties this all together was that if a child responds in a manner to protect themselves from sensory stimuli, such as crying or arching away from the stimulus, caregivers may become less confident and more tentative with their caring for him, thus creating less consistent and less frequent contact, and then leading into insecure attachment relationship. I will say it's worth noting that this is a foundational study, and further research should definitely be completed to support this predictive theory. However, the results from several other studies combined with this are enough to suggest that the relationship is present and should be considered when assessing or treating either sensory modulation or attachment. So here, referring back to our visual, we add a second arrow. So since we know that research shows that trauma can negatively impact sensory modulation, we now also have separate research that shows that attachment and sensory modulation systems are correlated and that deficits or poor development in one can be predictive of poor development of the other. And finally, we look at the research behind how all three of these processes can contribute to cycles of intergenerational trauma. We know that trauma can negatively impact the development of attachment and sensory modulation processes in a growing child. However, what happens if that child grows up with those underdeveloped neurosequential processes and maybe they were never addressed? We now have an adult with insecure attachment or sensory modulation deficits. And then if that adult has their own sensory modulation deficits that have been unaddressed, it may impact their ability to respond to or recognize their own child's needs. For example, a caregiver who is sensitive to auditory stimuli may become overstimulated by their infant's cry and may become overly frustrated or feel the desire to shut down. On the other hand, a caregiver who is understimulated by auditory stimuli, meaning they may not register it, may have difficulty registering that their child is crying, thus impact their ability to care for their needs. So one study looking at this relationship found that parents who report their own sensory sensitivities also reported more insecure attachment with their child. This kind of supports all of this correlative research and the fact that it can contribute to intergenerational trauma. So finally, to go back to our graphic again and kind of tying it all together, we understand how a parent's own experiences of trauma and underdeveloped attachment of their sensory modulation processes can contribute to the underdevelopment of their own child's attachment and sensory modulation processes. And then when that child grows up, it starts to cycle over and over again. While we don't traditionally think of trauma as being insecure attachment or poor caregiver attachment, it could be a mild form of neglect or poor attunement that impacts all these systems. So I want to note that this is not any sort of formal model or theory, rather just a thought process that occurred through examining all the research separately. However, from what we know and what we see with many of the families and clients at the Buckeye Ranch, we know how easily cycles of intergenerational trauma can form. I think if we start with any of these processes separately, it has the potential to have a positive impact not only on the current family system, but also on the healthy development of future family systems. Specifically through the lens of occupational therapy, we're going to look at sensory modulation. So the topic of sensory processing and how it impacts our youth and their participation in daily life has been a very hot topic over the past 15, 20 years or so. So with popular topics also sparks an influx of information, research, and everyone kind of has different understandings of it. So this also can spark an influx of inaccurate information, which is why I want to take a moment and mention some of the very common misconceptions that are understood by the public, clients, families, especially parents, teachers, or even professionals about sensory modulation. So the first one, sensory modulation and sensory-based motor deficits are the same. This is something very common and very commonly misunderstood. As occupational therapists, we treat both. However, we treat both deficits very differently. So I will go into the difference between the two here in a moment, but this is probably the biggest misconception that we're working to kind of correct. The second, children with sensory differences are just overreacting. This is something that is often thought of by parents and sometimes teachers. They see certain behaviors and understand them as a tantrum or lack of compliance or stubbornness, or that the child's just too reactive. And they often don't see or understand how those behaviors could be a response to sensory stimuli. This is where education personally, and then our ability to educate others is so crucial and can be so effective. The third, sensory modulation deficits are a form of autism. So, as previously mentioned, many people associate sensory modulation with autism. To reiterate again, they are separate diagnoses. And while many children with autism have sensory related deficits, there are many children with sensory modulation deficits that don't have autism. This is something we continue to educate professionals and the public about when identifying both and when seeking evaluation for both. The fourth, children with sensory sensitivities are sensitive to all types of sensory input. This is also something we'll discuss further here in a moment. However, an individual may respond to visual input different than they do auditory input or tactile input. Just because you're sensitive to one or undersensitive to one doesn't mean that you are sensitive to all of them. The fifth misconception is that sensory modulation only includes 5 sensory systems. So when we think about your senses, you typically think about your 5 senses. And those would be see, touch, hear, smell, and taste. However, there are actually 8 different sensory systems that we recognize, which now include the vestibular, proprioceptive, and interoceptive systems. And then finally, sensory modulation only affects children. Again, as previously mentioned, there are many adults with sensory modulation needs. We all modulate sensory information differently, and that does not change as we get older. It may just look different. For example, as a child, auditory sensitivity may look like outbursts by covering their ears when the bell rings or a loud noise occurs. And as an adult, it may look like the inability to focus in an open office space or the need to wear earplugs when sleeping. So it's not something that we just grow out of and you just grit and bear through it, which is why it's so important that we address it at a young age to kind of set individuals up with some supports so that they can be most successful in their future. We're also going to take a moment and talk about some of the crossover terminology that's used between professions. So some of the terminology that I have heard and read through literature throughout my time at Buckeye Ranch are dysregulated, hypervigilant, and overarousal. Dysregulated is certainly the most common term I have heard. So when asking many different clinicians what they're referring to when saying a client is dysregulated or gets dysregulated when or benefits from regulating activities, it was defined as sort of an encompassing term to describe when a child is emotionally or physiologically experiencing distress and requires assistance to self-regulate. As all of our systems work together and many clients often have different contributing factors to their dysregulation, I understand that this term and how many different intervention techniques to regulate can be encompassing. However, when looking at a child who seems distressed, as someone who is reading the situation from a sensory or an occupational therapy perspective, I think specific sensory related supports to provide that may be beneficial. However, clinicians looking at it from an emotional regulation lens may be thinking of different techniques to try and treatment. This makes me think of the famous phrase, if all you have is a hammer, everything looks like a nail. I think this is why it's important that we understand these processes as unique because they do describe different processes happening within our bodies. We would want our interventions and treatment to be focused on the accurate source of the dysregulation. So, for example, the approach taken by a practitioner with a heightened state of alertness deriving from a child's sense of safety and self-preservation could look very similar as the approach taken by the practitioner when a child has an over-responsive auditory system. In the first case, the child may create intimate, contained space that is free from outside disturbance. In the second, the same type of intervention may be appropriate for that moment, providing a quiet space free of loud noises and extreme sensory input. However, if you knew the source of the dysregulation, you could create a treatment plan that better supported them throughout their daily lives and future success, not just in one particular moment. So, for example, if it was a case of hypervigilance, you would want to focus on creating safe supports throughout their day and finding people in their life to promote safety and trust. However, if it was an over-response from auditory stimuli, you could modify their environment and provide noise-canceling headphones or educate the family on ways to minimize noises throughout the day. So while these behaviors may look similar, the treatment approach would be very different. And to kind of circle back to our terminology and also to the overall purpose of this presentation, we don't want to be just blindly swinging with our hammers and hoping that a nail somewhere hits. We want to be certain that our interventions or techniques that we use um, are helpful for both sources of crisis. And if you do that, you'll have more overall and long term success because you know the reason behind a child's dysregulated behaviors. So, when thinking about sensory related topics, you've probably heard several different terms being thrown around. Even probably just in this presentation, you've probably heard me use several different ones, such as sensory processing or sensory modulation. So, we kind of need to understand the difference between all of those. So, here are some common terms that you've likely heard people use when describing sensory related topics. They differ primarily in the theory and the individual who created the models around each one. As we learn more about neuroscience and our unique sensory systems, kind of how they all go together with how we function, new models and definitions are created. So, sensory integration was the foundational term by Jean Ayers, kind of describing how sensory information impacts us and is defined as the process of receiving sensory information and turning it into a functional response. When Jean Ayers was first describing sensory integration, it was defined for children who had motor-based or motor planning sensory system deficits, thus the turning it into a functional response portion. We'll talk about this further in a moment, but when describing sensory integration, Ayers was talking about only three of our sensory systems, which are our proprioceptive, vestibular, and tactile systems. So sensory integration only involves those three. So then years later, Lucy Jane Miller, also a big name in the sensory world, started using the term sensory processing, which is described as our ability to effectively process and integrate sensory information from the environment. So this is more of a broad and more encompassing definition because it describes not only how we process but also and integrate sensory information, but also how the environment around us or the sensory stimuli we receive through all 8 of our senses impacts us. So within this definition, it describes how our sensory processing abilities can be seen as effective or ineffective. So Miller kind of used this information to go on to try to create her own diagnoses called sensory processing disorder, which is described as when sensory signals are either not detected or don't get organized into the appropriate response. So this is the first time we kind of start to understand why sensory systems respond or don't respond to sensory stimuli. The final definition is sensory modulation, which was defined by Winnie Dunn as the process by which the brain decides if sensory input is important or not. This is the definition and the model that I will be focusing on throughout this presentation because I feel it provides reasoning for both the neuroscience behind the processes and the reason for the behavioral responses. Over the years, there's been a lack of clear description between each of these sensory-related definitions. They've commonly been used interchangeably, which is why it's so difficult a lot of times to read about interventions or kind of divvy them out. There's been some blending conceptually between these descriptions, which has caused some real challenges with our understanding of our sensory processing systems. However, because they are so different, it's important that we understand the differences between all the different types of sensory-related topics so that we're not only interpreting and understanding sensory-related information accurately, but that we are using sensory-related interventions and treatments appropriately with all clients. So I know that kind of sounds like a lot, and for me, who is a very visual person, I have a hard time kind of divvying that out in my mind. So here's a simple visual I kind of created to try to describe the different types of sensory-related terms that we often hear. So the main difference I want to emphasize is that when you hear sensory integration, It's talking about motor planning or praxis types of deficits involving only a few sensory systems. However, sensory processing or sensory modulation refers to more how our body receives sensory input from all 8 sensory systems. So you may hear sensory processing and sensory modulation kind of used interchangeably because they're both talking about similar processes, meaning how we process sensory information from the environment. However, the key thing to remember between the two is that sensory modulation is our body's ability to process or pay attention to or tune out certain types of sensory input. So as described on the last slide, one of the common types of sensory-related terms is sensory integration. This is one that I think is very commonly used, but this is also one that I feel it's very important we understand the difference too. So again, sensory integration is how we receive sensory input and turn it into a functional response. As occupation that focuses on movement as it's related to our daily functions, sensory integration was first seen in individuals with poor gross or fine motor skills. When looking at deficits, we divide them into 2 different subtypes of either motor-based or praxis-based deficits, meaning it's either an issue with the body's ability to complete the movement or it's an issue with the body's ability to plan and execute the movement. Unlike sensory modulation, sensory-based motor issues or sensory integration again only involves the 3 sensory systems of proprioceptive, tactile, and vestibular system. For an individual who has sensory integration or motor-based sensory issue, they may present differently for each of the 3 systems. So for example, the tactile system, for someone who has motor-based issues with this, would often maybe grasp things too tightly or write with too much pressure. This is also where you would see very poor fine motor skills, such as like inability to button buttons. Then within the proprioceptive system, they may appear very uncoordinated. They may look at their feet when walking. And then the vestibular system may appear as though they have delayed development of motor milestones such as crawling, walking, standing. These would also be the individuals with difficulty with bilateral coordination, riding a bike, catching a ball, etc. So if a child has sensory-based motor issues, they will also be treated by occupational therapists by addressing their fine and gross motor coordination within their daily activities to help them participate in developmentally appropriate occupations. It's essential that we understand the difference between sensory-based motor issues and sensory modulation because there are many interventions that claim to be sensory interventions, and we need to accurately determine if they would be beneficial for a child based upon what we are aiming to treat. So meaning, someone says, here's an intervention. Well, is it aimed at more of a motor-based deficit or is it aimed at more of a sensory modulation-based deficit? So if you notice a child has a motor-based sensory deficit impacting their development, it is truly best that they seek treatment from a licensed occupational therapist. So while it's important to understand the difference between sensory-based motor issues and sensory modulation, again, the focus of this specific presentation is to help you better understand sensory modulation and how it may be impacting an individual's behaviors and overall well-being. So very generally speaking, sensory modulation describes how individuals process sensory input and how those methods or neurological processes guide our choices. So within this model, sensory input refers to both external and internal stimuli, so all 8 of our sensory systems. And modulation specifically refers to our ability to pay attention to relative sensory cues in the environment and ignore irrelative sensory cues in the environment. So one example that I've heard used to describe this is think about when you're driving a car in the rain. If you're by, there's a ton of sensory input happening. The rain, you're driving, your windshield wipers are going visually. You can hear the rain on your windshield. Maybe your stereo's on. So it's our ability to either pay attention to those necessary cues such as a sign on the road or the car stopping in front of us and ignore the irrelevant sensory cues such as the sound of the rain on the windshield and the windshield wipers wiping in front of you, um, and then how successful we are able to be with all those interacting. So there are two components to this modulation concept and to this whole model, which are what we call our neurological thresholds and our behavioral responses. So to describe sensory modulation, we utilize Dunn's model of sensory processing. This is a model that was created by an occupational therapist named Winnie Dunn, and it's based off emerging research in neuroscience behind sensory processing. So what they found was that within an individual's nervous system, they have certain thresholds for sensory input. Each individual also has different behavioral responses to those thresholds. So I'll describe those processes kind of more in depth in a moment. However, the primary features of this model that we want to remember is that we have to consider an individual's neurological threshold for sensory input. We have to consider their self-regulating strategies or their behavioral responses. And then we also must consider the interaction among the thresholds and their responding strategies. So here's a very simplified version of Dunn's model of sensory processing describing those two components. So the vertical bar or axis represents an individual's neurological threshold from low to high continuum. The horizontal bar axis represents an individual's behavioral response to their neurological threshold for sensory stimuli on a continuum from passive to active responses. So while the model is a continuum meaning that an individual's sensory modulation threshold and response may fall at any point along either of the axes, the four most common interaction points, kind of the four boxes around it, make up different common sensory modulation styles. We'll talk about each one of those sensory modulation types or styles here in a moment, but first I kind of want to break down the description behind our neurological threshold, so that vertical axis, and kind of describe that a little better for you guys. So, as briefly described, an individual's neurological threshold for sensory input, which first I want to pause for a moment and break that term down because we're going to be using it very frequently throughout the presentation. So I want to make sure that everyone understands what I mean when I say it. So neurologic threshold. Neurologic refers to our nervous system, specifically our autonomic nervous system. Threshold refers to the amount or the level of stimuli at which our body or nervous system notices the sensory stimuli. So to put it together, an individual's neurological threshold refers to the point where there is enough sensory input to cause the nerve cell to activate. For example, at the most basic level, when maybe referring to auditory stimuli, the neurological threshold would refer to how much noise or amplitude of noise is required for the nerve cells within the ear to activate. This would impact what sounds or what levels of sounds it would require for an individual to notice them. So like I previously mentioned, our neurological thresholds are on a continuum from low to high. Meaning, if an individual has a low threshold for sound, it may take very little noise for the nervous system to notice the stimuli. And on the other hand, if an individual has a very high threshold for sound or auditory input, it may take a lot of noise at high volumes for them to even notice the stimuli. So our neural mechanisms are always attempting to balance between being excited and inhibition for responding to an accumulated amount of sensory input. However, kind of what we get in return to this balance is the development of our neurological thresholds, which are generally considered to be fully developed around age 8. And from what we know is that they are influenced, our neurological thresholds are influenced by both genetic and environmental information. Again, there are often many different terms that are thrown around to describe an individual's neurological threshold for sensory input. For those with a very high neurological threshold, many people refer to their sensory processing abilities as under-responsive, hyposensitive, or sensory seeking. For those with a very low neurological threshold for sensory input, many people refer to them as over-responsive, hypersensitive, or sometimes defensive towards sensory input. So, breaking the two kind of down on each end of the continuum, individuals who have a high neurological threshold for sensory input require high levels of sensory input to activate their neurons. They often appear to react slower or less readily to sensory stimuli. These individuals may miss sensory stimuli that others would notice. When thinking about it as a bucket of water that needs to be filled to the top in order for them to notice the stimuli, you could think of it as though the individuals with high thresholds are working with a larger bucket or a bucket that has holes in the bottom, meaning they require a lot of sensory input before it's noticed. And then on the other end, individuals who have low neurological thresholds for sensory input have a nervous system with neurons that trigger more readily to sensory stimuli. So they will notice the sensory stimuli more easily and more often because of how readily their sensory systems activate. They may appear more distracted by both internal and external sensory input. When thinking about the example of the bucket of water, individuals with a low threshold may be working with a thimble-sized bucket, meaning it only takes just a tiny amount of water or sensory input for their bucket to be full. So, because neurological thresholds, this component within the model, is a very cornerstone part of it, I want to take a moment and sidebar and talk about the physiology behind our neurological thresholds. I feel that this is probably the component of the model that is most crucial for us to understand both personally and to be able to communicate to others, to teachers, to parents, etc. But the main takeaway is that our neurological threshold or response to sensory input is a physiological response. And it's that physiological internal response that influences our ability to successfully emotionally regulate and self-regulate. So this goes back to our common misconceptions that it's not a child just overreacting to sound because they don't like it. It's the body having an internal physiological fight, flight, or freeze response to this type of sensory input. So the physiological component to sensory modulation is apparent when looking at an individual's autonomic nervous system. We know that our autonomic nervous system regulates our ability to adapt to environmental changes through modulation of sensory, motor, visceral, and neuroendocrine functions. This balance occurs through our sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems. These two branches of our ANS function together to promote adaptation and self-regulation in response to internal and external environmental demands. So our sympathetic nervous system is the one that modulates immediate responses to an event. This is what we call our fight, flight, or freeze reaction, while our parasympathetic nervous system modulates our visceral and neuroendocrine systems with self-regulation and ability to recover from a stressor. So when an individual experiences sensory stimuli, either internal or external stimuli, if they have a low neurological threshold, it may cause their sympathetic nervous system to evoke a fight or flight response, which is then it's up to their parasympathetic nervous system's ability to habituate or self-regulate in response to this stimuli in order to bring their body back to a state of homeostasis. So then going back to looking at our neurological thresholds on each end of the continuum, for those with a high neurological threshold, their sympathetic nervous system is under-responding, meaning it takes a lot for them to notice their sensory, motor, or visceral or neuroendocrine changes. So with a high threshold, the body signals are too small. A lot of times this is apparent and there's a lack or reduction of increase in heart rate with the introduction of stimuli. And then on the other hand, individuals with a low neurological threshold have an over-responsive sympathetic nervous system that is extremely sensitive to sensory stimuli. Not only is their sympathetic nervous system sensitive, their parasympathetic nervous system is extremely inefficient. So, with the introduction of sensory stimuli, an individual with a low threshold may experience the stimuli as a threat and have that fight or flight reaction with their heart rate increasing and increased sweat response. Then, while a typically functioning, what we consider typically functioning parasympathetic nervous system would come in and help the body self regulate, this inefficient parasympathetic system can take up to 3 hours to help the body return to a point of homeostasis. So, while this physiological response makes sense conceptually, we knew that we needed research to support this theory. So, previously, there's been a lot of devotion to building the framework behind sensory modulation and sensory processing from social theories, observation, parent survey on behaviors that their child presents with. Um, However, newer research involving actual neuroscience shows that these sensory processing patterns really are reflected within their brain activity. So, primarily, they have used research looking at the electrodermal response and rate of habituation in the presence of sensory stimuli. There have been many studies in the past, probably like 10-ish years, that have looked at electrodermal activity, meaning the change in electrical conductance of the skin as a result of endocrine sweat gland activity. So these studies take a sample of children with what you would consider typical sensory responses and children that have been previously identified as having atypical sensory responses. And by that they mean like behaviors. So then they following, they call it the electrodermal protocol, which involves hooking up electrical skin conductance sensors on the skin. And then researchers introduce sensory stimuli such as noise or bright light and measure how much individuals sweat and how much their heart rate increased in response to the stimuli. They then also look at their habituation rate, meaning how long it takes their heart rate to return to baseline and the electrodermal response to subside. These studies have shown that individuals who were behaviorally over-responsive to sensory stimuli also demonstrated elevated electrodermal responses and decreased habituation to stimuli. They have found that these differences in the sympathetic and parasympathetic responses derive from differences in the structure and the function of the nerve cells. So researchers use these results to suggest that an individual's sympathetic and parasympathetic nervous systems may disrupt their ability to achieve and maintain a calm, focused state in the face of sensory stimuli encountered in daily life. Further, something that we can definitely all agree upon is that when an individual is in crisis, internally their ability to participate in healthy social interactions is very limited, which is why we see that in the presence of crises. So if they're normally baseline, their neurological threshold is low or high, in the presence of crises, it pushes them even further onto either end of the continuum, which can make it obviously very, very difficult to function in these situations. So because our neurological thresholds impact how we notice or detect sensory input, they then can impact how we respond to or become irritated by sensory input. So it can be difficult for individuals to balance the demands of their neurological thresholds with their cognitive mechanisms, such as attention, memory, problem solving. Further, they can impact our daily choices and can be reflected in our mood, our temperament, and the overall organization of our daily lives. So back to our example of sound, if someone who has a low threshold for auditory input is in a loud and chaotic environment, such as a school setting, it can make it very difficult, as you can imagine, to focus and pay attention on cognitive tasks when the body physiologically feels as though it's in crisis. If they have no choice but to be in an environment that is causing auditory overstimulation or what we call sensory overload, and their body is in a continuous state of crisis, it would certainly impact their mood and temperament. So now that we have a deeper understanding of our neurological thresholds, I want to get back to Dunn's model of sensory processing and understand how someone with a physiological response to sensory input is not enough. We know that our internal responses and feelings often have a significant impact on our external responses. Thus, that is where her behavioral response component fits within the model. So, as we know, the thresholds are on a continuum of low to high. The behavioral response we have to sensory input is also on a continuum, but from passive to active. So, when looking at these two ends of the continuum, individuals with high or low neurological threshold can often be internally dysregulated by the presence or lack of sensory input. Therefore, they employ different self regulation strategies to help themselves manage or to achieve a sense of internal homeostasis. So, those who have a passive behavioral response, we think of as they let things happen all around them or let the sensory input occur as usual and then they respond to it. It is often described that they are acting in accordance with their neurological threshold, meaning they allow the sensory input and don't do anything to make sure that it doesn't occur. It is common that those with passive responses are living with sensory deficits, and because they are passively managing it, it goes unnoticed. On the other hand, those that have the active behavioral responses are the ones that we typically think of when thinking of sensory processing deficits. Those are the ones with the active behavioral strategies. They use them by trying to control the amount and type of sensory input they experience, meaning they are trying to actively either achieve or avoid triggering their neurological threshold. So here's a diagram of Dunn's model of sensory processing that is most commonly used. If you were to Google it, this is probably the one that would initially pop up. However, I don't think that it's the easiest to read, but you can see where I've highlighted kind of in the center there the vertical axis, which is the neurological thresholds from low to high, and then the horizontal axis, the behavioral response from passive to active. Again, what I've highlighted in the center are those interaction points that we talked about earlier within the model. So Dunn used those four points of interaction between the two continuums to describe four different sensory styles of sensory modulation. Those are what we refer to as sensory seeking, which is the combination between a high threshold and active response, sensory avoiding, which is the combination between a low threshold and active response, sensory sensitivity, which is a low threshold with a passive response, and low registration, which is a high threshold with passive response. Okay, so we are going to talk about each one of these different sensory modulation styles. The first sensory style we're going to talk about are sensory seekers. These individuals have a high neurological threshold for sensory input and use an active response to achieve it. So sensory experiences in an average daily life are not enough for them because of their high threshold, and they're often searching for additional sensory experiences for themselves so that they can achieve that threshold. For this child in the photo to the right, it wasn't enough for him to just be playing with shaving cream with his hands and feeling the sensation just on his hands. He was seeking more out of this sensory experience, and he wanted to feel the shaving cream on his face, on his arms, etc. So it's common for children who are sensory seekers to seek additional sensory input within normal activities, such as humming or making mouth noises, tapping pens. Maybe they're running their finger along a brick wall while they're walking down the hallway. These individuals may seem as though they're just exerting a bunch of energy to get sensory stimuli, which is why it's so common for them to also have ADHD as a dual diagnosis. They often love physical movement, such as climbing, swinging, twirling, bouncing, as they are commonly seeking like novel or new sensory experiences. They may be quick to initiate activities, but then have difficulty finishing them because the newness of the sensory input wears off quickly, or their body habituates to it very quickly. So some common behavioral characteristics of sensory seekers are that they're energetic, they're very creative, maybe facilitators of change, very animated, and very active. So For each of these sensory modulation styles, I want to use the example of a child at the beach. So, for someone who's a sensory seeker, at the beach, it may be the kid that's laying or tumbling around right at the shoreline and just letting the waves crash against them so that they can feel not only the weight of the water, but the feeling, the temperature of the water, the sand that's blowing around against their skin. So, just that really intense sensory experience that they're trying to achieve. The next sensory style we're going to talk about is low registration. So, these individuals also have a high threshold for sensory input. However, they use passive strategies in response to it. So, these individuals are often under responsive or don't recognize sensory input. If you think of one phrase when thinking about low registration, think they don't notice. I like this photo to the right because someone with low registration may not notice that they're wearing two completely different shoes or shoes on the wrong feet because they don't notice how they fit, or tactily or proprioceptively, they don't notice how they feel on their feet. They may not notice when someone enters the room, when someone addresses them or says their name, when they have dirt or food on their face. These individuals often won't notice when they get hurt or bump into things. Meaning that the sensory input that occurs from these very common situations isn't enough for them to notice that it's even happening to them. Thus, they may require additional sensory cues to get their attention, such as repeating their name several times, etc. So, individuals with low registration also may not find their caregivers or teachers stimulating enough, and it may seem as though that these individuals don't care. So, some behaviors associated with this sensory style are often sometimes misunderstood. Because they don't notice some levels of sensory input, they may appear disengaged or that they don't care or that they're zoning out. However, they may also seem very laid back, accommodating, comfortable in many environments, and can remain focused in the presence of environmental distractions. So you can imagine how a child with low registration may appear at home, in school, within the community, and within their family system. So then getting back to our example of the beach, for a child at the beach, someone with low registration may be the child playing by himself, building a sandcastle, not noticing the sand all over their face, the sun making them overheat, or the other children playing next to them, or their parents trying to talk to them. They may appear that they're just kind of in their own world. So now moving on to those with low neurological thresholds. The first style we look at is the sensory style called sensory sensitivity. So these individuals have a low threshold for sensory stimuli and use passive strategies as a response to it. These individuals have nervous systems that are geared to notice every detail and notice the sensory stimuli more readily than others. However, they still let it happen, thus having the passive response. So it's important to note that they still may be experiencing an internal physiological response to the stimuli, and they may still feel that fight or flight or freeze feeling on the inside, but they don't address it externally to try to prevent it from happening. So these individuals may experience caregivers or large group scenarios as very overwhelming. They're trying to internally manage the potential of becoming overwhelmed. So they may seem cautious, highly aware, or detail oriented. So when I say manage, I don't mean that they're trying to avoid it. They just seem very maybe hyper aware of it. So one interesting example I heard about sensory sensitivity one time was someone talking about going to the movie theater. They were talking about how going there and how all they could hear throughout the movie is the sound of people chomping on popcorn kernels and shaking them against their box, and the squeaking sound of the straws in the cups as people go to drink. So while these are sounds that we hear at the movie theater, if we were paying attention to them, we are often subconsciously hearing them and able to drown them out and focus on the movie. But for someone with a sensory sensitivity, they may not be able to focus on the movie because these sounds are so distracting and so bothersome. So this individual may still go to the movie and in the presence of these distracting noises may remain silent, but it's still very internally frustrating and distracting to them. So now, thinking about that, imagine a child in a classroom full of 20 other students and how difficult it may be to focus, or how sensory stimuli occurring around them could interfere with their ability to focus or participate on their daily tasks. So then back to our beach example. At the beach, the child who has a sensory sensitivity style would maybe the child that's sitting in the sand playing with others but doesn't move around in the sand from the spot they initially sit down in. Maybe they're constantly turning their head to see who's walking by or who made that noise, etc. So our final sensory modulation style we're going to talk about is sensory avoiding. These individuals have a low threshold for sensory input and use active strategies in response to it. So while sensory seekers have a high threshold and always want more sensory experience, sensory avoiders want less and less. Because their nervous systems experience certain stimuli as harmful or dangerous, evoking a fight or flight response, they're often using active strategies to try and avoid the stimuli altogether so that they can avoid experiencing that internal reaction. Thus, these individuals are always trying to find ways to limit their sensory input. So remember that you may consider an average amount of sensory input may be very overwhelming or internally dysregulating for these individuals. Therefore, those who are sensory avoiding are often most successful when their sensory input is predictable. So this is a key feature of sensory avoiders. They will like and be most successful with a very strict routine because they will know when sensory input is going to occur and they can manage it before it happens. They create routines to keep their life peaceful and manageable. So for example, in school, if a child knows the bell's going to ring at the certain times, they can use the active strategy of covering their ears before it happens, or if they know the playground's going to be busiest right after lunch, maybe they prolong eating so that there are less children and less sensory input on the playground by the time they get out there. However, these are also the children that when unpredictable sensory input happens, they may seem to have a meltdown in response to it because they're constantly working so hard to avoid sensory input that when it happens so fast without any warning, they may become very internally and emotionally dysregulated very quickly. So some common behaviors that may present with sensory avoiders are that maybe they look very ritualistic or controlling. They may seem bossy when playing with their peers, or sometimes maybe inflexible. However, these individuals may also be very successful independently or when they're playing alone. So a child on the beach who is sensory avoiding may refuse to ever leave the beach towel. They may use shovels to build a castle instead of their hands. They may want their sunglasses or hat on at all times. They may hate being in the ocean because of the unpredictability of the waves or the sand against their body. So the beach may be honestly a total nightmare for a child with this type of sensory style. So on this slide, initially when this was going to take place in person, this was going to be kind of an interactive activity where you watch each of the video examples separately. And based on the information that you've heard thus far, guess which sensory style they match. So what we're going to do is I'm going to play each video. You can pause it, kind of reflect on your own, and then I'm going to provide a description of which sensory style it matches and kind of the reasoning why.
Penny, that's where I sit.
Sit next to me.
No, I sit there.
What's the difference?
What's the difference?
Here we go.
In the winter, that seat is close enough to the radiator to remain warm and yet not so close as to cause perspiration. In the summer, it's directly in the path of a cross breeze created by opening windows there and there. It faces the television at an angle that is neither direct, thus discouraging conversation, nor so far wide as to create a parallax distortion. I could go on, but I think I've made my point.
Do you want me to move?
Well,
Just sit somewhere else.
fine.
Sheldon, sit!
Okay, so when watching that first clip, which is a clip from Sheldon from The Big Bang Theory, we see an example of sensory avoiding. So we first consider when watching this video what we feel his threshold for sensory input is, low or high. Because he appears to be very hyper aware of sensory input in his environment, such as the temperature, breeze, view of the television in the room, we would assume that he has a low threshold. Then, when looking at his behavioral response, the telling feature in this video is that Sheldon's trying to control where he sits in the room because he knows the predictive sensory input he will receive in that spot. And if he sits anywhere else in the room, it might change. So the two key words to take away from this are that he's trying to control for predictable sensory input. He's avoiding the unpredictable sensory input by controlling something as particular as where he sits within the room.
Yeah, I think it's still. Try it. Bah.
Okay, so that one's kind of hard to watch sometimes. But this next video that we just watched was a child participating in pumpkin carving and pulling out the insides and gagging. This would portray of someone who has sensory sensitivity. I love this video because I think it's a great example showing how a physiological response is occurring. So looking at thresholds, we see that he has a very low threshold for tactile input, meaning just touching the wet pumpkin inside is making him physically gag. This is also a relatable example showing thresholds because for about half of us, touching pumpkin guts is not bothersome, but for the other half, they feel gross and icky and may even cause us to gag. I personally am definitely one of those people. So then moving on to his behavioral response, this threshold has obviously been met and he's obviously being overwhelmed internally. However, he's continuing to participate in the task, thus showing that he has a passive behavioral response. He's definitely noticing the sensory input very readily, but he's not doing anything to address or avoid the sensory overload that he's experiencing.
Just seems kind of crazy in a way I might need right now.
I don't know. Oh, that's not yours.
Stanley just drank OJ out of my mug and didn't seem to realize that it wasn't his hot coffee. So the question has to be asked, is there no limit to what he won't notice?
What's a 7-letter word for purse?
Satchel.
No, starts with an H.
Handbag.
Thank you.
All right, everybody, take a seat. As you may have heard, our branch on the planet Jupiter is up 8,000% in sales.
Hold up. That clock is slow. It is 5 o'clock. I will see you all tomorrow.
Bye, Stanley. Love you.
So that video you just watched of Stanley from The Office is a very comical, maybe potential exaggeration of what low registration sensory style may look like. So when first looking at the threshold, we determine obviously that his level of awareness for sensory input is very high, or he has a high threshold for it. So we see that he doesn't notice any sensory input at all, first starting with the fact that he drank orange juice instead of coffee and didn't notice, all the way to blocking out all the visual and auditory input that are completely out of his normal input. From this, we know he has a very high threshold, meaning it would take a lot for him to notice sensory input. And then moving on to his behavioral response, we ask ourselves, is he trying to actively seek input to meet that threshold, or is he passively kind of just sitting by? And we obviously see that he's not trying at all to seek more sensory input. He's just kind of going on with his usual task of doing his crossword, and not only does he not notice the crazy sensory input, but he's also able to maintain his focus on this task the whole time. So like I said, this is kind of a bit of an over-exaggeration, but it mimics certain features of how someone with low registration may behave.
It is fun! It's just that it's not fun with the fun going on.
Okay, and then this last video shows a subtle example of what sensory seeking sensory style may look like. So in the video, we see a couple of children rolling down a grass hill covered in cattail seeds. And when looking at their thresholds, we can observe that this is a very sensory rich experience with the rolling, which would give proprioceptive and vestibular input, and all the textures they feel throughout it, such as the pokey grass on their bare skin and the cattails just flying all around them. So from this we can tell they have a high threshold for sensory input. Then when looking at their behavioral response, we can see that they're actively seeking this sensory rich experience. They're not just doing it once just to try it out, but they're doing it over and over and over again. So for this next kind of activity, I wanted to provide you with an example of what sensory overload, or of what someone with a low threshold may experience internally on a daily basis. So this video is created by an individual with autism, and it shows how sensory experiences that occur in what we may consider normal daily environments may impact our ability to function. So we're going to pause here and watch that.
Two, three, four, five, 6, 7, 8, 9.
Take my hand.
Okay, so after watching the video, we see how someone in a shopping mall may be interpreting sensory input. They're noticing every sound, every bright image, every fast movement, etc. So we get some insight into how the body is experiencing this input as threatening and the physiological response that is occurring. We can hear this individual's heart start racing and their breathing speeding up. We can see the child trying to kind of calm themselves and manage, but they're unable to because the sensory input is just so extreme, and they eventually going into like total panic meltdown mode. So I like this video because it shows how for others the mall may be a completely normal, or what they consider normal, environment that they can function in, but for someone with a very low threshold it may be extremely dysregulating and impossible to function in. So I kind of challenge you to consider how someone with a low threshold may feel in a classroom, a hospital setting, throughout the community, at home, in a very chaotic home. And then imagine people kind of demanding that they focus on their work or on a conversation that they're having with them, when internally this is how they may be feeling. So now that we understand how our sensory modulation systems work from a broad perspective, I want to go into how sensory differences may look in each of our 8 sensory systems. Again, I want to touch on one of our common misconceptions that we only have 5 senses, but that with continued research we have learned that we actually have 8 total sensory systems. The 5 commonly known, which are auditory, visual, tactile, olfactory, gustatory, and then the 3 additional systems, which are vestibular, proprioceptive, and interoceptive systems, which I'll explain deeper in a moment. Before breaking each sensory system down, I want to note that part of Dunn's theory of sensory modulation, again, is that our sensory style may be different for each sensory system. We may have a low threshold for tactile input and a high threshold for auditory input, and vice versa. So this is why understanding a child's sensory modulation differences may be so complex. We can't just generalize that because they have a low threshold or active response for one system and avoiding input, that they are sensory avoiders for all sensory input. While there are some general patterns that many individuals fall within one sensory style, it is not that case for everyone, and that's why we must remember in the back of our minds when we're trying to understand a child's behaviors. So what has sort of divided our understanding of our sensory systems is where the sensory input is coming from. So we've always understood our external sensory systems of auditory, visual, tactile, olfactory, and gustatory input. However, we know that this input comes from our external environment and that's something happening to our body from the outside. Our newer, more recently recognized sensory systems of vestibular, proprioception, and interoceptive systems are our internal systems. So we know what is happening internally in these 3 systems also occurs through similar neuropaths and evoking similar physiological responses as the external ones. And further, from our sensory modulation perspective, we know that these 3 internal systems can also have an impact on our behavior, self-regulation, and temperament. So by understanding where the sensory input is coming from, or where the dysregulation from the sensory input is coming from, we have a better understanding and guidance when trying to determine which sensory interventions or supports to provide to individuals. So the first system we're going to look at is our auditory sensory system. Our auditory system is responsible for helping us interpret what we hear and to what frequency we hear certain noises and sounds. When thinking about sensory modulation, our sensory style impacts our ability to filter out or pay attention to important auditory cues in our daily environment. For individuals with sensory modulation deficits, this may be very difficult. For someone with a high threshold, it may present as difficulty paying attention, or they may require directions to be repeated to them several times. Difficulty modulating auditory input can have a significant impact on an individual's ability to be successful in the school environment because there's so many sounds going on in that environment consistently. Our visual sensory system is responsible for how we interpret what we see regarding colors, shapes, lighting, movement, etc. Within our environments. So our sensory modulation systems help us process the visual stimuli and determine what is necessary or unnecessary information. It helps us filter out and organize the visual input we are taking in. For example, someone with a low threshold may be unable to filter out the presence of clutter or bright lights. They may not respond to this overwhelming input immediately like you may imagine, but over time it could be impacting their mood or their ability to focus. Another important thing to note is that our visual system is often responsible for how we process someone's nonverbal cues they're giving us via facial expression or body language. So someone with a very low threshold may notice and pick up on these cues from others very well, and potentially at times maybe they're hyper aware of them, while someone with a very high threshold may not notice these nonverbal cues at all. So this is helpful, I think, to understand when questioning why an individual can't tell if we're mad or upset. So we also know that individuals process visual input at different speeds. For example, individuals with autism who tend to have a very low threshold for external sensory stimuli process visual input faster than others do. That can be very helpful, and that can also be very overwhelming. So after talking about the auditory and visual systems, I want to sidebar and talk about how someone's sensory modulation and style is not inherently good or bad. It's easy for us to think about how it negatively impacts our daily functioning, but it's important for us to understand that and have families understand that it can be kind of a double-edged sword. So having a very high threshold or a very low threshold for auditory or visual input can have its benefits. Having a very high threshold can be helpful when trying to focus on tasks in an environment where people are walking by, where there's loud noises, or having a television on might not be distracting for them because the nervous system isn't paying attention or it's filtering out all of those cues. It may make them very laid back, etc. But on the other hand, so for someone with a very low threshold, it's easy to see how it might be difficult, but they can also be very detail-oriented. It can be beneficial because they notice all the small stuff, such as a change in someone's tone of voice or their body language, or their observation skills. They can maybe read the mood of a full room of people, which can obviously have its benefits when determining how we interact with our peers. Our tactile system helps us locate physical sensations and differentiate what type of tactile input is safe and what type is dangerous. So our tactile system is one that we often think of when thinking about sensory processing deficits. So children who can't stand tags on their shirt, or when their socks are twisted, or when their hands are messy, are often a demographic that is historically understood as having quote-unquote sensory issues. So with that understanding of sensory modulation and neurological thresholds, we know that this having a meltdown over the tag in their shirt or dirt on their hands could be someone with a low threshold for tactile input, and that these common sensations are causing sensory overload and internal physiological crisis. So someone with a low threshold, light touch or someone brushing by them on their way by may be interpreted as dangerous or invoking an immediate fight or flight response. The tactile system is another system that is closely associated to social interaction because we naturally touch each other as we interact throughout the day, whether it be intentionally with a handshake or a pat on the back, or unintentionally as maybe we're passing through a crowded hallway. So sensory modulation with the tactile system can be very complex because different receptors within our skin and our tactile system detect and perceive different types of touch. It's possible to have a low threshold for certain types of tactile input and have a high threshold for others. So next, moving on to our olfactory, which is our sense of smell, and our gustatory system, which is our sense of taste. I kind of combined them. So while these are separate systems that could have separate sensory modulation styles, I'm going to kind of lump them together here for a moment because they are systems that kind of work together. So our olfactory system, again, refers to our sense of smell. One thing to note is that because this is a chemical process, the olfactory system is actually our only system that does not involve kind of routing through the thalamus like all of our other senses do, but it goes straight to the amygdala. So that's why we have very strong memories and emotions associated with certain scents. Our gustatory system refers to our sense of taste. From a sensory modulation perspective, it kind of helps us identify which foods taste good, which foods may be dangerous. Certain foods may cause comfort or alarm. When we associate those who are picky eaters with low thresholds for gustatory input, so while it's often common that the texture of the foods is disliked, there's also sometimes a gustatory component. So when someone with a low threshold may not like foods with strong flavors, such as spicy or citrusy foods. On the other hand, someone with a high olfactory or gustatory threshold may prefer or seek out these really strong scents or spices within their daily life. The next system we're going to talk about is the vestibular system. So when you think vestibular system, think movement. However, because movement's involved in almost everything we do, the vestibular system is very complex and also very impactful. Its primary role is to work with our auditory and visual systems to help maintain our balance. So that's probably what you think of when you think vestibular balance. So because it helps control our balance, the vestibular system has a very close relationship with our sense of safety, survival, arousal, and attention. Additionally, it can impact our alertness, our coordination, visual tracking, digestive systems. So, it impacts a lot. And the complexity of the vestibular system lies in the role of our inner ear, specifically our semicircular canals and the otoliths. The semicircular canals contribute to our alertness. They are activated or amped up by acceleration or deceleration, by rotation, and by unpredictable movements. On the other hand, our otoliths are beneficial in calming us down. They are activated or most effective when we are completing linear, predictable movements, such as going front to back, side to side, or up and down in a very rhythmic manner. So when thinking about sensory integration and sensory modulation, remembering that they are two very different processes, we look at how the vestibular system from a sensory integration perspective, we're looking at our capabilities related to movement, balance, and coordination. However, when looking at our vestibular system from a sensory modulation perspective, we're looking at how vestibular input or movement impacts our physiological or internal regulation. So what sort of movement can we pay attention to or ignore? One example that helps me differentiate this is someone with a low threshold for vestibular input would be the person who gets motion sickness really easily or feels sick or dizzy if they stand up too fast, whereas someone with a high threshold for vestibular input maybe would love or would easily tolerate roller coasters or activities with a ton of motion. The vestibular system is one that we have a little more understanding on when it comes to healthy development and activities that support healthy development of the vestibular system. We know that physical developmental activities such as rolling, crawling, climbing, and then all the way to maybe jumping and swinging are necessary for healthy development of our vestibular system. When our body isn't experiencing these movements throughout neurodevelopment, it can kind of cause an underdeveloped vestibular system, making the brain and body feel unsafe in the presence of movement, thus initiating sort of a survival mode response to the presence of movement. Research also shows us that those with underdeveloped vestibular systems have difficulty sitting still, with their balance, with motor planning, problem solving, attention, and organizational skills. So knowing all of this and knowing that we need some of these consistent developmental movements from infancy to adulthood, let us consider maybe how trauma, especially neglect throughout infancy and early childhood, may impact the healthy development of our vestibular system. On the other hand, knowing some children or individuals that have experienced trauma, do we see any of these deficits? And do we see them as an underdeveloped vestibular system potentially playing a role? Obviously, we don't know for sure because we know that correlation doesn't equal causation, but I think it's something interesting to think about and consider. Proprioception is one of our more recently defined senses. Proprioception helps us determine where our body is in space. So when you think proprioception, think muscles and joints. Proprioception is another one of our sensory systems that's involved in both sensory integration and sensory modulation. So when you think of someone with an underdeveloped proprioceptive system, from a sensory integration perspective, they may be very uncoordinated because they have difficulty knowing where their body is in space. So they're clumsy, awkward, they may bump into things. And as many of you are working with adolescents, I do want to touch that proprioceptive deficits, specifically motor-based proprioceptive deficits, are very common during quick times of growth. However, when you think about proprioception from a sensory modulation perspective, we think about what proprioceptive input we're able to pay attention to or ignore. As we know, proprioception has to do with our muscles and joints. Proprioceptive input comes from movements in our muscles and joints, but also pressure to those muscles and joints. So as many of you probably heard before, proprioceptive input or deep pressure can help activate our parasympathetic nervous response and help calm us down. So someone with a high threshold for proprioceptive input may have difficulty noticing or ignoring when their muscles are tense, or vice versa. Providing proprioceptive input is very common, a very useful tool to help calm our nervous system. Thus, I want to kind of touch on some of the neuroscience behind proprioception and why and how it helps calm us. So proprioception occurs in our muscle bellies. When we think proprioceptive input and muscle contraction, it generally has to do with muscle flexion. So we squeeze our muscles together, sometimes without noticing, in an attempt to calm ourselves or remain calm during times of stress. So think about a time when you're stressed and your shoulders are tense, you clench your jaw, or even in times of extreme distress when you maybe go into fetal position because you're squeezing or flexing your muscles together as much as physically possible. This is kind of our body's natural attempt to keep us calm or to engage or calm down that sympathetic nervous system. So what's happening from a neuro perspective is that every time the muscle belly squeezes and contracts, the signal goes through the nerve and into our spinal cord and into our Golgi tendon receptors, which is maybe something you've being heard referred as our proprioceptors, and then sends a signal to our brain via the anterior spinal thalamic tract. So proprioception has to do with how we experience pain. When something is painful, such as a scrape, hot temperature, or for some people it could even just be light touch, when one of those things happens, it travels through our lateral spinal thalamic tract. Our lateral spinal thalamic tract is our survival tract, or what we consider our fast lane. And the signal in that tract goes directly up to the thalamus and then to our motor cortex when we respond. So think of a time you got a scrape or you slammed your finger in a door. You might not realize, but there's a very predictable reaction occurs. When a painful stimulus occurs, we first feel the pain from it, and then we instantly grab it and put our hand over it and apply pressure. This again is our body's natural way of using proprioceptive input to relieve pain and calm our nervous system. Proprioceptive input travels through then our anterior spinal thalamic tract, which we think of as the slow lane or more thoughtful lane. One way to show this is by pushing against a door frame with the back of your hands for about 30 seconds and then walking away. Your arms will naturally rise because the slower proprioceptive tract doesn't know it has stopped yet. So proprioceptive input can be very effective, and its impact can last up for hours. So that's why we often suggest proprioceptive strategies to help calm us in times of emotional or internal crisis. Much like our vestibular system, our proprioceptive development is prominent during infancy. Research shows us that trauma experienced during infancy and during crucial neurodevelopmental periods may have an impact on the development of our proprioceptive system. During infancy, our systems are not yet capable of providing our own proprioceptive input, which is why infants are often regulated or soothed by being held or swaddled, and become upset and dysregulated by being laid down or by their clothing being taken off, like during a diaper change. So in a healthy child-caregiver relationship, a small child gets hurt, and then they run to their caregiver, who kind of scoops them up for a hug or to rub their injury to help calm them down during times of dysregulation. And then as we grow older, we learn through what we call regulation and dysregulation loops, meaning that because we have secure caregiver relationships and those tools to calm ourselves, we learn that a little bit of dysregulation or a little bit of maybe trauma is okay. So interoception is our 8th and final sensory system we're going to talk about. This is the newest and least well-known sensory system. Interoception describes our ability to identify internal physiological cues. So again, when thinking about sensory modulation, it's our nervous system's ability to notice internal cues and then further to give meaning to them. When we're able to notice an internal cue, such as heart racing, breathing faster, muscles tensing up, it helps give us meaning to what's happening around us and then taking action. if we aren't able to even notice those internal body signals, it can be very confusing and difficult to manage the way we are feeling. Understanding interoception and our ability to notice these internal cues can be very beneficial when trying to understand a child's behaviors or ability to self-regulate. Thus, we're going to kind of dive a little deeper here into interoception. Our interoceptive system helps us identify or notice those internal physiological cues such as hunger, fullness, body temperature, the need to use the restroom, nausea or constipation, pain, illness, sleepiness, heartbeat, need for breath, muscle tension, sexual arousal, physical exertion, sensory overload, and emotions. Our interoceptive system works together with our vestibular and proprioceptive systems to help us perceive what is going on both inside and outside of our bodies. Specifically, when looking at interoception from a neuroscience perspective, it occurs within the insula in our brain. The insula is a very small region in our brain that is sort of our receiving zone that reads and identifies what the body's physiological state is and helps us generate and connect its subjective feelings. So 2 words to pick out of that are identifies and connects. So it identifies the body signal and it connects it to meaning. The dorsal posterior area of the insula is the noticing portion and responsible for noticing visceral sensations such as pain, hunger, or heart rate. And the right anterior portion of the insula is the connecting to meaning portion, contributing to our subjective feelings of emotional awareness regarding these sensations. So in looking at interoception and our sensory modulation styles, someone with a low interoceptive threshold may experience internal body signals as too big or too overpowering. They may notice hunger sooner or more intensely than others do. They may feel pain more acutely or for longer periods of time. On the other hand, someone with a high interoceptive threshold may not notice the physiological signals at all. Their body signal may seem muted and they may not be able to notice the signals until they are really intense and then to the point where they're unbearable. When it comes to experiencing pain, they may not notice pain at all unless it's extreme, and then instead of being able to manage it, the body would just instantly go into crisis mode. So remember a couple slides ago I mentioned that interoception impacts not only how we notice these internal signals, but also how we connect or give meaning to them, thus impacting our emotions. So research shows us that our ability to identify physical sensation directly relates to how we identify and regulate our emotional states. Interoception helps us feel the emotions such as relaxation, anger, sexual arousal, sadness, frustration. Imagine A, not being able to feel them when these things are happening in our body from a physiological perspective, and then B, not even being able to recognize the feeling associated with it. It would be very confusing and difficult to manage difficult circumstances in our lives. Or on the other hand, imagine feeling these things so intensely on a baseline level and then something traumatic happening and being expected for you to manage it on your own. And then finally, our interoceptive abilities related to our emotions can then impact our self-regulation, our self-awareness, our social skills, and our overall social participation. This whole ripple effect, starting with our ability to even notice what's happening within our bodies, begins with our neurological threshold for interoceptive input. So if you're interested in interoception and learning about it, I would suggest looking up Kelly Mahaler. She's an occupational therapist that specializes in interoception specifically, and she has some great resources to help individuals improve their interoceptive awareness. In one of her presentations, she used a graphic very similar to this one to describe what happens during a moment of crisis and how emotional regulation plays a role, stemming all the way back to our interoceptive awareness. So back to our example of noticing like a ding in your car, healthy development, in a healthy developed interoceptive system, you notice the internal signals. Maybe your heart rate increases, tight muscles, your face starts to get hot, and then you connect these body signals to identify that you're becoming very angry, and you connect it to the emotion of anger, and you have the urge to react. And then because you're able to properly notice these feelings and connect them to the emotions, you're able to appropriately self-regulate before blowing up. And then, so maybe you go for a walk. That's your reaction. And then the outcome is that your physical discomfort fades, your heart rate decelerates, your muscles relax, and you manage your emotions or self-regulated effectively. But again, imagine how this may go much different if you weren't even able to notice these signals happening, or if you weren't able to accurately connect them to an emotion. Research shows us that when we're looking at interoception and trauma, it shows us that poor interoception specifically is related to many mental health conditions such as anxiety, depression, ADHD, OCD, eating disorders, or obesity, suicide attempts, and drug and alcohol addiction. So as I previously mentioned, Dr. Scott was initially going to present on Bruce Perry's model and NMT and the portions of it that may impact sensory processing or sensory modulation. So while I'm not going to attempt to do this because I'm in no way an expert or qualified to discuss NMT concepts, I am going to describe what's happening in the brain when we receive sensory input and how our sensory modulation style may potentially look within an NMT chart. So what's happening in the brain when we receive sensory input? While each of our sensory systems are unique and involve different types of neuroreceptors and neural pathways, we know that once they reach the brain, a rather predictable path is taken. So what's the first thing that happens? Our body is introduced to the stimuli. It then converts that stimuli into an impulse through the process of transduction. It then conducts that impulse to our central nervous system through the process of transformation. The signal then comes up through the brainstem. It travels through the thalamus, again with the exception of olfactory input. The thalamus is a crucial part of our sensory modulation system because this is where it's determined if the stimulus is important or not, or threatening or not. The stimulus then travels through our amygdala, where an emotional response to the stimulus occurs, and then finally it reaches our cortex, where the cerebral or behavioral response occurs. So much like NMT, we understand our processes of sensory modulation as the integration of multiple sensory systems to kind of form that higher order schema. So starting in the brainstem to the thalamus, where the physiological response occurs, and then to our limbic system, where the physiological response is connected to an emotion, and then to our cortex, where our cerebral response occurs, impacting how we respond. So here's a copy of the NMT brain map. When looking at the brain map, there are specific portions that do relate to occupational therapy scope of practice and broadly of sensory systems. However, going back to the difference between sensory integration, or our motor-based deficits, and sensory modulation, and knowing they are different systems, we need to be able to see the processes within the brain map separately. So I want to emphasize that the highlighting on this chart is no way evidence-based, but rather me kind of highlighting and separating into two different categories the processes just from my own conceptual understanding. So what's highlighted in green would generally be related to our ability to recognize or ignore sensory input with sensory modulation, while what's highlighted in yellow would generally be related to our motor skills and motor planning within the sensory integration concepts. Next, we're going to discuss some assessment tools or kind of screening tools that you could use to help determine if sensory modulation may be the source of some of the behaviors that you're observing. Because most of the good standardized assessments required to be completed and scored by a licensed occupational therapist, these tools that I'm providing you are kind of short tools that are more of short screeners. So if you feel a child's sensory modulation style is having a significant impact on their behaviors, it would obviously be best to seek a formal referral and evaluation from an occupational therapist that specializes in sensory modulation. The first assessment is called the Motivation Assessment Scale, or the MAS. This is a very basic, simple tool to determine the motivation behind certain behaviors. The scale seeks to determine if behaviors are seeking to achieve 4 different categories, including if they're seeking to achieve sensory needs, escape, attention, or tangible needs. Some of the pros of this one are that it's not profession specific and requires no certification to complete. It's very good to use when specific behaviors are present, and it can kind of help divvy out or highlight the driving source behind a behavior. However, some of the cons are that it is, when it comes to sensory processing, I don't think it's very good at highlighting specific sensory needs related to their sensory style. And then also, because it's so broad, it has pretty poor validity and reliability. So this short assessment is 16 questions long, but here's an example of the layout in the first couple questions. There's a scoring key at the bottom that kind of guides which question relates to which type of motivating behavior. For example, like question 1 and question 5 relate to sensory processing, while question 3 relates to its attention seeking. And as previously mentioned, because this assessment is so broad in general, if it is best if the behavior you're trying to identify is very specific. Within the instructions, it even states that using "they are aggressive" would not be as good as using "they hit other people" when using this assessment. This next assessment specifically has to do with identifying an individual's interoceptive awareness. As previously mentioned, Kelly Mahaller has a ton of great resources related to interoception, including a really great assessment. However, it's not free to the public, I don't believe, so you would have to pay for it. But this one is free. It's called the Multi-Dimensional Assessment of Interoceptive Awareness version 2, or the MAIA2. It's a free assessment related to interoceptive awareness. It's a 37-item state trait questionnaire that breaks down interoceptive into 8 factors of awareness, including not distracting, not worrying, attention, regulation, emotional awareness, self-regulation, body listening, and trust. It's also, like I said, not only is it free, but it's also available for anyone to administer. So another potential benefit is that it looks specifically at interoception, which is nice. However, it does have poor internal consistency and reliability, which it could be due to the fact that it's a self-report style, so it leaves a lot of room for subjectivity when answering the questions. But I will say that most interoceptive assessments are self-report. So in order for them to be accurate, a person would have to have a pretty good understanding of their body, emotion, and emotional awareness in order to answer the questions about their emotional awareness, if that makes sense. So that's why it can kind of be hard assessment-wise to identify someone who has poor interoception. So here's an example, kind of some screenshots from the MAIA2. On the left are some example questions within the assessment. They're also on a Likert scale from never to always. And then on the right is a graphic of the answer key within the assessment. You can see how similar to the motivational scale, each question is kind of related to each of the factors that impact interoception. The next assessment I want to briefly touch on is called the Adolescent Adult Sensory Profile. This was an assessment that was created by Winnie Dunn herself. Thus, it aligns very well to her model and to sensory modulation. So the assessment is 60 questions. It's also self-report because it's for adolescents and adults. The child version is based off of parent report. Um, it determines how an individual generally responds to sensations throughout their daily lives, including at home, school, or work. So this is one of the only sensory-specific assessments that's made for adolescents and adults. Additionally, it is by far the best psychometric-wise, and it's standardized, has good reliability, and moderate validity. So in the occupational therapy world, we kind of consider the adolescent adult sensory profile to be kind of our gold standard tool to assess sensory modulation and its impact on our emotional regulation. So obviously the biggest downside to this assessment is that it's not free and that it has to be scored by a licensed occupational therapist. And originally when I was going to complete this training in person, I wanted you all to complete it with me scoring it so that you could see how it differs from some of the free assessments and how much more specific it is, especially as that relates to sensory modulation. So not to sound redundant, but this is another reason why seeking OT evaluation would be really important if you felt that the client's sensory modulation was having a significant impact on their daily lives. The last one we're going to kind of talk about is a short checklist that I personally made. I made it based off of some common sensory related behaviors that generally coincide with each different sensory modulation style. This is kind of meant to be a rough guide for you to use to determine if sensory modulation specifically is playing a role in a child's behaviors and overall well-being. And I want to emphasize that obviously this is in no way a formal assessment. It's more of a checklist of common behaviors. And that because our sensory modulation styles can be very complex and differ among each sensory system, information that it reveals should definitely be used with caution. But that one way it could be used is kind of as a guide to some sensory modulation related language or phrasing to use when describing to families or to have families to describe. When talking to primary care providers or within your own documentation, specifically if you're trying to get a formal OT evaluation. So here's a screenshot of it and kind of just listing some of those behaviors. You will have access to this. I think Dr. Scott will probably be emailing out all these resources for you, all the assessments and everything. But then also a copy of the checklist that I created. So just kind of showing in that top box, those are just some of the behaviors related to sensory seeking. And then obviously I kind of described each one separately throughout. All right, so kind of final steps. We've talked about sensory modulation, what it is. We've talked about how you can kind of identify it. So finally, we're going to talk about some sensory-related supports or techniques that you can use within your own sessions or treatment plans. So the intervention techniques I provide are going to be what we refer to as may help, won't hurt strategies. So these are sensory-related supports that, when used appropriately, will not cause any harm but may help. Again, a licensed occupational therapist would be the best when providing formal intervention for sensory modulation deficits. However, children whose sensory modulation style is only impacting them in a small way, or you may think just be part of the problem, sometimes just some simple sensory supports can have a positive impact. So I know one of the most frustrating parts about these trainings is that presenters often give you all the theory and the explanation behind the topic, but leave you wondering what to do with it. So I personally feel that just accurately understanding sensory modulation is the biggest tool that you can have to even begin to try to understand how to incorporate it into your treatment planning. One, because there are so many different types of sensory related perspectives. Two, because there are so many misconceptions regarding sensory modulation and our ability to change someone's sensory style. And three, because there's many different interventions over the years that I think have become popularized and then generalized to everyone who has sensory differences, and they may not be appropriate or effective for everyone. Which is why I think just having a very clear understanding of what it is you're looking at can be your biggest, most effective tool. So the first way all this information that we've talked about up to this point will help inform your treatment It'll be by educating caregivers. So, as I've learned through observation of sessions and meetings with Buckeye Ranch families, ability to communicate and articulate information is a great skill that you all have. As with anything else, our ability to communicate with caregivers on how an individual's sensory modulation style may be impacting their behaviors or overall well being is just as important. So, if a caregiver can take your education and then have their own basic understanding of sensory modulation's role in daily life, it can help equip them also with their own tools to support their child. The next way it can help inform your treatment is activity selection. So, if you feel a child may be a sensory seeker, for example, you may start sessions with some heavy work or some movement before asking that they sit still to have some like heavy discussions. Or if you feel that they have a sensory sensitivity or sensory avoiding, you may choose to have your sessions in a quiet or more calm setting to kind of set them up for success. And then the third way, which kind of tapers down to our next bullet, is that providing education on environmental supports is one of the most basic but yet very effective ways to manage sensory modulation. These are our most kind of useful may help won't hurt strategies. And then these supports, the best thing about them is that they can apply within a family's home, within their classroom, at the ranch, in the community, etc. So before we get into some of the specific treatment strategies, I just kind of want to touch on this for a moment. This is a model of treatment that I came across kind of in my research, and it's called Safe Place, which stands for Sensory Attunement Focused Environment. I will say that it does seem kind of broad when looking at sensory modulation specifically. For example, they kind of combine motor-based sensory integration principles with sensory modulation principles. However, I feel they have some of the key features of the model align really well with Buckeye Ranch's trauma-informed care principles. So this model is centered around family involvement, and the key features include recognition of sensory needs, co-regulating and improved caregiver attachment, and then finally traumatic healing. So this is a model that was created out of the Kumar Center in Massachusetts, and if you're interested in it, they have a ton of resources on their website, such as podcasts and learning materials. I think maybe even some CEUs, I don't know, related to this model if you're interested in looking further into it. So from an occupational therapy perspective, when providing intervention for individuals with sensory modulation differences, we aim to create a match. We have very little evidence from any of our research that any of our occupational therapy interventions can change an individual's neurological threshold or even change their sensory modulation style. Therefore, we kind of aim to create a match with their sensory style instead of trying to change it. We create this match by creating a supportive environment, modifying their daily routines, tasks, and activities. And then the next thing we aim to do, especially with some of the older children or adults, is to target their cerebral response or behavioral related response related to the sensory experiences. If we feel they're capable of understanding their own sensory modulation style, they'll definitely be most successful in organizing their daily lives to match their sensory needs rather than try to change them. So when creating a match, there's different strategies we can use, different sensory supports we can use. And so we're going to kind of go into some different sensory-related interventions that you may find beneficial to apply in your sessions or treatment planning. Again, these sensory supports will directly be related to sensory modulation needs, not any sort of motor-based deficits. I'm going to first start out by providing you some very general, very broad sensory support principles, techniques for each sensory system, some environmental supports, and then finally some sensory supports that specifically are kind of aimed at calming and co-regulating. Some general rules of thumb that apply when thinking about sensory modulation is that those with low neurological thresholds need slower transitions throughout their days. Additionally, they'll be most successful, again, with a very predictable schedules and routines. This, again, goes back to these individuals kind of needing control or needing to be prepared for the sensory stimuli they're going to experience throughout their day. Because this threshold for sensory input is so low, the smallest amount of unpredictable input can easily cause sensory overload and dysregulation. So I came across this photo to the right. Someone posted it, I think, on Facebook recently, and they were talking about our current quarantine rules amidst COVID-19, and also in the midst of Autism Awareness Month. So if you can't read it, it says, the whole world is overwhelmed by sudden change of routine. It's not that easy, huh? So I love a good, relatable example when trying to explain how someone with sensory modulation difficulties may be feeling. So these past couple weeks, the amount of change to our daily routine has been a lot, and it's been difficult for a lot of us. And I can personally admit that at times it's been very internally dysregulating, causing my own physiological responses and issues. So this is a small comparison of how someone with a low threshold may feel when we abruptly change their routine and expect them to just quote unquote adapt. But then kind of looking back, so individuals with high neurological thresholds, those individuals in general obviously take a lot of sensory input to reach their threshold, so they may need energizing interactions and activities incorporated throughout their day. They may need assistance translating their actions into words. And because the two sensory systems related to high thresholds may look very different, you may use different supports. For example, those with low registration, you may need to repeat instructions, repeat instructions several times, or even repeat their names several times to get their attention, while those who are sensory seeking may be most successful when their day-to-day schedule or activities are full of physical movement and sensory-rich activities. So some general rules of thumb when working with a group of children, such as in group sessions or in the residential houses, is that we must recognize, A, that the group will likely be comprised of children with a variety of sensory styles. So this can be difficult when choosing which sensory reports to provide. However, we know that in general, it's good to provide a combination of unstructured and structured activities. Providing opportunities for unstructured active play can allow children with a low threshold to play independently, and children with a high threshold to get in a lot of movement, activity, and interaction. Additionally, we want to provide opportunities for structured movement. We know that movement and activity is essential for developing brains and keeping attention on tasks. So when you provide structured movement such as brain breaks on like Go Noodle or yoga or dance, it allows children with low thresholds to get that active but activity and that input in a very predictable manner. But it still provides sensory input for children who have high thresholds who need more of that. And then finally, because vestibular and proprioceptive input is often good for all types of sensory styles, selecting activities for groups that involve providing vestibular and proprioceptive input can probably be most beneficial for individuals on both ends of the neurological threshold continuum. So then next, when looking at sensory supports related to each different sensory systems, I divided them up between supports for individuals with low neurological thresholds and supports for individuals with high neurological thresholds. However, when selecting these tools, remember to also consider their behavioral response and if they're actively trying to reach that threshold or avoid that threshold, or if they're just passively responding to it, because the supports that you choose can have be more impactful if you're aware of those responses. So first, when looking at our tactile systems, for individuals with low neurological thresholds for tactile input, we must remember that very small amounts of tactile input is all it takes to overwhelm their nervous system. So think about how much tactile input our body receives throughout the day, just in general, whether it be the morning shower, the clothes we wear all day, a handshake, a hug, a pat on the back, the surfaces we're sitting on, the things we're holding in our hands, etc. Therefore, those with low neurological thresholds, what you may consider a normal amount of input, may still be too much. So for these individuals, the main thing to remember is to avoid unexpected touch, such as when you're walking by or a hand on the back while speaking to them. Instead, try to use maybe words to communicate or try a high five or a fist bump. That way they have some control over if they want to participate in that tactile interaction or not. And then additionally, because they may prefer to control the amount of sensory input they receive, allowing a child to line up at the end of the line or the back of the group or at a desk on the end can often help prevent unpredictable tactile input from others. Clothing is often a huge issue for those who have low thresholds for tactile input. They're going to notice every tag, every seam, every rough or ill-fitting fabric to the point where it can be difficult for them to focus on anything else throughout their day. So purchasing clothing with soft fabric, elastic waistbands, no seams, and removing tags can often make a huge difference. And just remembering that, like, if a child's refusing to wear jeans, that they may be more successful if you allow them to wear leggings or sweatpants or even jeans that have a lot of stretch or soft materials instead of just denim. And then lastly, these individuals often will hate having their hands messy. So if you think of the homunculus, which is that kind of depiction of our sensory input, and you think about how the tactile sensory receptors we have in our hands, we know that input from our hands is extreme. So thinking about like a lot of art activities that we ask children to do, such as like finger painting or paper mache or even gardening, can be very overwhelming and internally dysregulating. So sometimes simple modification to the activities, such as supplying gloves, tools, or even a shovel, are enough because they don't have direct contact with the substance. Now, on the other hand, individuals with high thresholds for tactile input may always be just touching everything in their environment. So, understanding that behavior for what it is, and that understanding that sometimes all that can be distracting, or in times it could seem inappropriate. You can also provide them with supports such as sensory bins, or giving them maybe like allowing themselves to give themselves a hand massage with lotion or even fidget toys. And then also when teaching new concepts, these individuals may benefit from using touch throughout the learning process. It might kind of help them relate it and tie it all together. So when looking at our auditory system, individuals who have a low threshold for auditory input, just like tactile input, can have a difficulty functioning throughout their day in what you may consider a normal environment because of the tendency for a lot of unpredictable auditory input. This is evident especially in settings where there's a lot of people, such as in classrooms, on the playground, in a restaurant, or even a grocery store. So one very traditional method people have found to manage this sensitivity would be to provide someone with headphones to dampen or block out any sort of auditory input. However, this is one of those intervention techniques that got so popular so quickly that people started using it inappropriately. For example, if you're going to provide a child with headphones, they should only be used in specific situations or specific settings. They should never be wearing them all day, every day. Because if you can consistently block out all auditory input they're receiving, it can make even small amounts feel intolerable. Another effective method is to provide advanced warning about loud sounds that may occur. So this is often very possible within school settings. When warning a child about the bell that's going to ring at the end of the class period, or if there's going to be a fire drill and what time that's going to be, that allows the child to be prepared for it, or to try to avoid the input, maybe by covering their ears so that their nervous system doesn't become so overwhelmed. And then additionally, in the school or home settings, when asking a child to focus on a task, being aware of the auditory input around them. Simple things like reducing background noise and allowing them to work independently or in smaller groups can be beneficial. If you're going to play music or have the TV on, sometimes having it very low levels or using instrumental or calming noises would be best. And then for those with high thresholds, they may benefit from the exact opposite strategies. To focus, they may benefit from headphones, playing music. This can be helpful with motivation and attention. One of the big things to remember for individuals with high thresholds for auditory input is that they may not register you addressing them or talking to them. So we must remember that it's not simply them ignoring us, and we have to have the patience with our verbal instructions, allowing to repeat yourself if needed, and also when giving verbal instructions, it may be beneficial to have them repeat the instructions back to you to know if what they're actually auditorily registering what you said. Because when a child with a high threshold is trying to focus, it can be often difficult if they're not even hearing what you're saying. And then finally, when trying to relax or sleep, these individuals may benefit from sleeping with a fan or some sort of music in the background. When looking at our visual system, those who have a low threshold for visual input may be very distracting. So visual input doesn't always occur like unpredictably unless you maybe flip on a bright light really fast or are watching an action-packed film. However, a lot of clutter, bright colors, or bright lighting can often cause dysregulation without them even noticing. Therefore, it's best in general to keep clutter within the home or school environment to a minimum. We know that dim or non-fluorescent lighting is always best. However, if you do have to use fluorescent lighting, which is pretty common, covering the lights with fabric is often pretty beneficial. And you may also want to allow these individuals breaks from visual input when needed, such as in a very crowded or visually busy space, kind of allowing them time in a blank or quiet space can kind of help break up some of that visual input. And for those with a high threshold, they may need more and more intense visual input to notice it. This could mean using bold fonts, larger writing, or high contrast mode on like computer screens. And then additionally providing visually stimulating toys such as like fidget spinners, tops, or LED color changing lights may be beneficial when helping maintain focus during maybe like an auditory task. So when looking at our olfactory and gustatory systems, for those with a low threshold for olfactory input, you may want to avoid strong perfumes, air fresheners, or candles. Also, using mildly scented detergents may be beneficial. Kind of remembering that a scent you don't even notice, they may be noticing and it may be causing distraction. And then also remembering to be aware in spaces where there's a lot of mixed scents, such as like in a school cafeteria or a restaurant, and perhaps allowing those individuals to have some extra space in those spaces. But then on the other hand, those with high olfactory threshold may benefit from the use of like really strong scents, such as essential oils on their wrist or neck, or even on their pillows or blankets at home. And then when looking at our gustatory system, those with a low threshold, as we've previously talked about, is often associated with picky eaters. And again, it might not just be the texture that they're not liking. They may not also like the flavor. So those with a low threshold, you may want to offer foods that seem bland to you or smaller amounts of salt or seasoning. And then on the other hand, those with a high threshold may prefer foods with really strong flavors and spices or a lot of salt. And then another simple trick is to kind of have them chew gum or suck on candy throughout the day or during a task to kind of help provide some of that input. So our vestibular system can be very tricky. If you think about the inner ear and its complexity and then think about all the other input that influences our vestibular system, it can be very difficult and it can be a lot to kind of divvy out. So when thinking about sensory modulation deficits regarding our vestibular system, you have to understand that vestibular input can be very impactful. So one big thing to remember that I want to note is that the warning signs that something is off with the vestibular system are often mistaken as behavioral issues, such as poor attention and increased anxiety. And just as deficits with our vestibular system can be very impactful, any sort of vestibular intervention can also be very impactful. Its effects last anywhere from 3 to 6 hours after the input. So for that reason, you want to respect a child's preferences, especially one with a low threshold. If they request to stop an activity, especially one with a lot of movement, allow them to stop it right away. Because again, an overwhelmed vestibular system and its effects can last up to 3 hours after that. So one thing to note is that in general, vestibular input is either calming or alerting. So for those with low thresholds, providing vestibular input is generally most needed for calming. And calming vestibular input involves that gentle, linear, rhythmic movements such as rocking, bouncing, etc. For an individual with a high threshold for vestibular input, they may benefit from what we consider alerting input, such as a lot of movement or hanging upside down, jumping, swinging, in sports. One other thing I do want to note, and I want to emphasize, is that spinning is an activity that has been suggested, especially for like sensory seekers. It can also be a calming strategy for them to help. It helps provide input, and like I said, at times it can calm them. However, spinning is definitely like hands down the most vestibular sensory experience that we can provide, and its effects last up to 6 hours. After a very short amount of time spinning, it causes the vestibular system to literally shut off, and then as a response of not being able to handle the input, it causes that nausea and vomiting. And if this was too much input, it can cause a meltdown because their vestibular system is just off. So there's a lot of conflicting research on spinning, and personally, I feel like as a clinician, I would avoid suggesting spinning as a vestibular strategy, but rather allow it to be more of a self-directed by the child. If it's something they prefer kind of using on their own as a calming strategy. Similar to our vestibular system, proprioceptive input can also be calming or alerting. Deciding on which type of proprioceptive input to provide depends on the child's current state. So in general, those with a low threshold for proprioceptive input may require more calming strategies. However, those calming strategies can also be provided to those with a high threshold that's experiencing crisis. But when looking specifically at low proprioceptive threshold, we will often need that calming input such as deep pressure, stretching, and yoga. Additionally, you may want to kind of avoid forcing excessive movements or activities such as sports that require like heavy work or a lot of contact. And then individuals with high proprioceptive thresholds may more commonly benefit from that alerting proprioceptive input, such as climbing, running, contact sports. Heavy work is a very popular intervention technique used. This involves providing proprioceptive inputs to the joint and muscles through, again, what we refer to as heavy work. Some common heavy work tasks include like pushing or pulling heavy objects, climbing, crab walking, bear walking, etc. And then looking at interoception. Interoception can look very different when looking at different neurological thresholds. For example, we know that individuals with low neurological thresholds are very attuned and are able to pay attention to very small physiological cues internally. But on the other hand, those with high thresholds have a difficulty noticing those internal cues and having a harder time relating those internal cues to a particular emotion and then emotional response. Therefore, when talking about interoceptive process as a whole, we refer to it as our interoceptive awareness. So in order to facilitate self-regulation and healthy emotional responses, our interventions will seek to improve generally our interoceptive awareness. Again, we have no evidence that we can change our threshold for noticing those internal cues, but we can provide strategies to improve our interoceptive awareness process as a whole. Some interventions that focus on providing interoceptive awareness are resources, again, created by Kelly Mahler. They are also included in the document packets you should receive. The first we're going to talk about is the body emotion action chart. This is a very kind of simple table that's a brainstorming tool for children to use when they are not in or before they're in internal crisis. Um, the middle emotion, such as like the sad or angry category, is already filled out, and the child is challenged to think about what they might feel inside their body when they're sad, and then the urge to react with a certain action, emotion when they're sad, kind of on the other end. Body checks involve moments of mindfulness. There are resources easily online. A lot of it has to do with like you kind of cut out a body and little Velcro stickers such as hot or tightness, but basically, but what body checks are checking in on how your hands feel, how your heart feels, how your breathing feels, etc. Just kind of taking a step back and trying to be mindful, if at all possible, of those internal cues. Body checks can be used in preparation for moments of crisis or in moments of crisis, but they'll be most effective if they're practiced ahead of time. How does your engine run is a very basic tool often used with younger children that helps them describe how they're feeling internally, especially related to the amount of energy that they have. And then finally, one I think very beneficial technique I have seen is using a heart rate pulse oximeter to help individuals notice how it may feel to have an increased heart rate or rapid breathing with a visual support. So, for example, you could have someone do a bunch of jumping jacks or run and then throw that pulse ox on and show them how their heart rate's elevated, have them talk about how it feels, and then doing some breathing techniques to slow their heart rate with that visual support kind of on their finger showing how it feels to have your heart rate up, how it feels to do the breathing, how it feels to feel your heart rate come back down. Next, we're going to talk about some environmental supports for sensory modulation. A key thing I've definitely previously emphasized is that which is especially true for environmental supports, is that it's all about creating a match. We aren't trying to change someone's sensory style, but we want to create environments that support their sensory style. While you may not be able to do that in every single environment they come across, modifying their primary environment, such as home, school, or work, can have a positive impact. So I want to start by looking at this photo. Obviously, clutter and disorganization is never really ideal. However, I wanted you to look at this photo and consider how it may have different impact for individuals of each sensory style. So, for example, consider if they would be successful in this environment. Someone who has a high threshold for visual, tactile, or proprioceptive input, it may not be difficult for them at all. They might even like it. However, for someone with a low threshold, this might be extremely overwhelming. And then imagine asking them to focus on their homework or on a one-on-one conversation when they're in this really distracting environment. So when looking at environmental supports, there's some very general supports related to our sensory modulation. These are especially relevant when thinking about creating an environment for like groups or individuals who have a variety of sensory modulation styles. These are some general rules of thumb that we suggest. So use natural and incandescent lighting when possible and minimize fluorescent lighting when possible. Walls should have a balance of quiet space with visual stimuli kind of varied throughout. It should be well organized. And as a leader or someone who has control over the environment, it's important to be aware of nearby environmental sounds or smells and to control for them or accommodate for them when possible. For individuals with a low threshold, you may want to reduce noise or visual input. When you do introduce input, because sometimes it's inevitable, do it gradually. So for example, don't just flick on all the overhead lights all at once. Maybe just start with a lamp or one side of the room. You want to provide spaces for like individual space. This is what we refer to as a time in space, which are often quiet, generally smaller spaces a child can go to reset. And then providing rocking chairs or headphones within an environment may be helpful additions. For those with a high threshold, you still want to create an environment that is structured, respectful, regulated, and soothing. However, because they have a high threshold for input, they may prefer interacting with peers. Therefore, you should provide opportunities and spaces for group activities. Also, these individuals may benefit from alternative seating, such as like the exercise balls, wobbly seats, rocking chairs, or surfaces with a variety of textures or firmness. Finally, we're going to talk about some general calming strategies that involve engaging our sensory systems. As many of your clients often need assistance with their self-regulation skills, I think these are some of the interventions you may find most useful and applicable. Again, having an understanding of someone's threshold for sensory input is essential when introducing a sensory support. So, for example, someone with low threshold may only need small amounts of input to help calm their overwhelmed nervous system, while those with a high threshold may need more input. Some of our most common basic calming strategies to help an overwhelmed nervous system include deep breathing, a warm shower or bath, soft or dim lighting, soft or low calming music, leisure walks, and soft like materials or textures. When looking at which sorts of specific sensory input to introduce to facilitate self-regulation and calming, we look primarily at our proprioceptive, vestibular, and interoceptive systems. These three systems are most effective because they have a direct impact on our stress response system. So, proprioceptive input is definitely the most popular and what some may consider the most beneficial sensory system to engage in times of internal stress and crisis. With an understanding of our stress response system, we know that during moments or even just increased stress, our body releases cortisol. This causes what we refer to as our fight, flight, or freeze response, engaging that sympathetic nervous system, where our heart rate increases, breathing picks up, blood pressure goes up. And when we provide proprioceptive input, such as deep pressure to our muscles and joints, it triggers a release of serotonin and melatonin, which are both calming hormones, while decreasing the secretion of cortisol. So our proprioceptive system is very effective in engaging our parasympathetic system, which is why it's so effective in calming. And it's also one of those where its effects can last up to 3 hours. I know I previously mentioned that proprioceptive input can be beneficial for both calming and alerting. So when first reading that, we assume, we would always want to just calm the nervous system. However, if someone has a very high threshold for proprioceptive input, we may want to introduce alerting stimuli to the proprioceptive system to facilitate an external calming response. Because we know input can either be calming or alerting, we first need to identify two things. What is the purpose of providing the input, and when will the activity take place? So for example, if the purpose of the input is to calm an overwhelmed nervous system, we want to introduce it before individuals become overstimulated, anxious, or distressed. This is when it will be most effective. But if we're looking to provide alerting input, we need to determine which times a day the child is disengaged or seeking input. Sometimes this involves providing proprioceptive input right before the child has to go to school, to a doctor's appointment, recess, back home, etc. This is what's often referred to as a sensory diet, when you pick certain times a day to provide that input. However, we know that's not always possible to predict when dysregulation is going to occur. So in those cases, we want to try to equip the child to use proprioceptive input during times of crisis, which is why we need to make sure that if we do, it's an activity that they are personally familiar with and have practiced before and can kind of self-direct. Some very popular and very effective proprioceptive calming strategies include weighted blankets, the use of lycra, which is a very stretchy, elastic type of fabric an individual can kind of wrap themselves up in. Lycra is also referred to as a body sock. You might have heard of it before. But if you don't have access to either of these, sometimes just wrapping up tightly in a blanket or quilt can provide the same sort of overall sense or proprioceptive input and have the same effects. Those first three strategies are great because they can be self-directed by an individual, and they can be great strategies to have in their toolbox of calming or regulating strategies. Additionally, providing deep pressure via a massage or even just a really tight hug from someone can be helpful. Obviously, this would only be effective if it could occur like in an appropriate or self-directed manner. Some other effective proprioceptive supports involve activities such as heavy work, like I previously described, such as climbing, running, yoga, swimming. Our vestibular system is another very effective system to engage to help with calming and self-regulating. Similar to our proprioceptive system, we must first consider an individual's threshold for vestibular input before introducing the stimuli. However, I kind of talked about this before, but as a general rule of thumb, providing rhythmic activities that involve linear movements are going to be most effective in calming because they involve those otoliths within our inner ear, which we know help calm our vestibular system. Some very useful specific vestibular supports that involve rhythmic and linear movements include rocking, bouncing, swinging, swaying to music. This could occur in a variety of settings with a variety of mediums, such as on a chair or a yoga ball, hammock, swing, teeter-totter, etc. I know I already talked about spinning and how it can be beneficial, but also very intense sensory experience that could have an extreme negative impact on behavior if used incorrectly, which is why, again, I want to emphasize not to introduce this type of input yourself, but to be aware of it because some kids kind of initiate spinning on their own to try to calm themselves down. And if that's the case, I wouldn't try to like stop it or take it away because it may be an effective strategy for them. So finally, targeting our interoceptive system for calming can also be beneficial. However, you're not necessarily it's not like the other systems where you're trying to provide interoceptive input. It's going to be focused at trying to improve our interoceptive awareness. And that again has to do with recognizing our internal body cues and connecting those cues to a particular emotion so we know how to respond. However, again, we have to be able to know exactly how we feel both internally and emotionally in order to manage it effectively. So back to some of our effective strategies that could help utilize our interoceptive awareness to calm an overwhelmed nervous system would be the body emotion action chart, body checks, and deep breathing. Again, these interventions would be, they would need to be introduced at an earlier time and practiced before the body is in internal crisis if you want them to be effective for calming. Okay, so we've talked about kind of all three concepts here. We've talked about the theory behind sensory modulation. We talked about how to identify it. We talked about some appropriate supports that could be used when deficits are present. So I kind of want to tie all three together and talk through a case study. So this case study was created based off of my own observation at Buckeye Ranch and some collaboration with her clinician and treatment team. You should have a copy of it, but if not, I'm also going to read it out loud here for you. So this case study is going to be based off of who we refer to as SE. The client SE is a 9-year-old female currently in the 3rd grade. SE was referred to TBR in 2019 by her adoptive parents due to difficulty with behaviors at school and home. SE has lived with her adoptive parents since birth. It has been reported that there was a history of intrauterine trauma and substance abuse from her biological mother. SE's adoptive parents provide a loving, supportive family system. However, they do report that it's often chaotic and kind of loud living environment. They report often feeling stressed and overwhelmed with SE, which at times can result in strong tones and unpredictable responses in their behaviors. SE's parents have described her as a difficult child who has been difficult to comfort and soothe since infancy. SE often seems to have an overreactive stress response. Essie's parents have been fearful of feeling like bad parents in the past when linking with services and agencies. However, they are extremely committed to caring for her and are devoted to making sure she is able to be most successful. Essie's parents are currently seeking formal evaluation from her primary care provider to determine if Essie has autism spectrum disorder. They feel this may help explain the behaviors and gain more understanding for both them and for others. Essie's parents have identified that she also struggles with sensory processing. Essie's mother reports bath time has always been difficult for Essie and does not like getting wet, drying off with a towel, or allowing lotion to be applied. Essie is very selective with which types of clothing she'll wear, often refusing to wear denim jeans. Essie's parents have previously attempted many interventions to try to help manage her sensory processing difficulties, such as introduction of a sensory table with many different mediums like sand, water, slime, kind of wet cornmeal, etc. Essie and her father recently, they like to kind of partake in these activities together, and they recently had a competition to see who could tolerate wearing wet socks for a longer duration of time. Essie's parents have spent a lot of time over the past year working on her ability to tolerate the different textures, and they felt that she was making progress. However, Essie's mother reports that she will still have a meltdown if a drop of water hits her foot in the kitchen unexpectedly, and that she still does not at all tolerate lotion on her skin, and this causes daily conflict in the home. Essie's parents have worked to introduce calming techniques for Essie over the years, including a weighted blanket, chewing gum, and increased routine. Essie responds well to being held tightly by her mother or using her weighted blanket when feeling dysregulated. Within the school setting, Essie has difficulty maintaining attention during tasks. She was diagnosed with ADHD in 2016 and often struggles with sustained attention, has difficulty listening to instructions, and often leaves her seat in situations where she's expected to stay seated. Essie's mother reports she often fidgets or taps her hands or feet and makes noises with her mouth. Essie has difficulty maintaining friendships with peers as she's often seen as too bossy and wants her friends to play by her rules. Additionally, Essie has a history of compulsions. Essie's mother reports that she lines up her toy cars by color and model and has to organize items on shelves in stores and cleans up maybe like a waiting room or a doctor's office when she feels they're disorderly. Essie has previously reported that it's difficult for her herself to ignore it when items are out of order in places she visits. She will easily get upset by disorderly spaces and will throw a temper tantrum if she's not able to organize it. Essie's mother reports these tendencies have been present since she was little. Okay, so here are some follow-up questions that I'd like you to pause, kind of reflect upon on your own, and then restart the video again, and I will talk through some of the answers. So the first question would be, according to the behaviors described, what sensory modulation style do you think Essie most likely aligns within? So I would say that this would be sensory avoiding. And then what are some sensory behaviors or key words that stuck out to help you identify the sensory modulation style you guessed? So some of the things that stuck out to me through observation and case reviews were her lack of adaptability, and on the other hand, her success with routine, how she does best when she's playing alone, how she can be kind of controlling, and then specifically when looking at some of her sensory systems, especially her tactile system, the meltdowns in the presence of the unpredictable input. And kind of, I know that there were some different sensory systems talked about throughout, but especially with that tactile system, it seems that she has always kind of struggled with tactile input, and especially when it's forced upon her. So then question 3, do you feel her parents' attempts at intervention have been appropriate or effective? And then if yes, which ones? If no, which ones? So I think some were effective and some have maybe been ineffective or maybe inappropriate just based on lack of understanding. So I think when looking at trying to improve her tolerance for tactile input, they've been operating under one of our misconceptions, which is trying to force change to her sensory style. Again, it seems like she has a very low threshold for tactile input. And when forcing her to put her hands in messy substances or wearing wet socks, she may be able to externally tolerate it when internally maybe her stress response system is and her physiological cues are like through the roof, which is why she would have the meltdowns in the presence of the unpredictable input. Why, after all this time, after all these interventions, that a drop of water on her foot can still elicit the same type of response as it always has. However, I do feel some of the appropriate techniques or interventions that they've introduced are some of the use of their calming strategies, especially the proprioceptive ones. With her weighted blanket and tight hugs, it seems like they've already tried to introduce that predictable routines. I think that would be very effective if those all continued in the future. And then what do you think, question 4, what do you think should be emphasized when providing education to parents? I think that this is education that many people and parents need to have a better understanding of, but the main thing is that she's likely has that low neurological threshold, and that internally that this is a physiological part of her neurological makeup. That low threshold is just part of her. You can't necessarily change it. And when you're forcing input, it's causing that internal physiological response that you may not see from the outside, or maybe sometimes you do see it. And then finally, when you're forcing input, because that sensory experience is attached to emotional responses and memories in our amygdala and limbic system, it can be harmful and it can cause negative associations. And then when that sensory input occurs in the future, it can cause an even greater deal of internal responses and external meltdowns. And then finally, our 5th question, what sensory related supports do you think would be most appropriated for SE? So when looking at environmental supports, since we feel she in general has that low threshold for sensory avoiding, I think she would benefit from decluttering, from soft lighting, from very predictable environmental input, especially auditorily. So maybe, I know it can be difficult, but reducing the amount of times where like of outbursts and yelling, maybe not even at her, but just to each other within the environment, or a loud TV, a door slamming, etc. Then when activities are routine, again, providing very predictable routines within both at home and in school, I think have been and will continue to be very effective. And then when looking at calming strategies, I think a lot more of the same, providing weighted blankets, deep pressure hugs, because she is so close with her adoptive parents, rocking. I think that these are strategies that they're already using, but if they were to introduce them maybe more regularly, or if they were strategic in the time where they introduce them, such as maybe before a stressful experience or right after a stressful experience, they may see even greater impact. So I know I've talked a lot throughout this presentation about how if you feel an individual's sensory modulation style or deficits are the primary factor behind their behaviors, that it would be best to seek a formal OT evaluation intervention. However, the next question would be, I assume, as their clinician, would be, how do I do that? Or how do I encourage their family to get a referral? So there are several different potential avenues to take. The first thing to know is that an occupational therapy evaluation or referral must come from either the individual's primary care provider or a teacher at school, For a teacher at school, it would have to be specifically related to their performance in school. So a lot of times the primary care provider is best. So I reached out to Dr. Scott and to Brittany Flora, who's a clinician here at Buckeye Ranch, who has recently had a lot of success in the past advocating for OT referrals, to kind of see what sort of strategies they found to be most effective. So first, you must be able to accurately and effectively educate the family or caregiver on why an occupational therapy referral could be beneficial. So this goes back to describing that it may not be because describing to the family that it may not be because the child needs help with their dexterity or coordination, but clearly articulating to them what sensory modulation is, how it may be presenting, and how it may be impacting their child's behaviors or overall daily functioning. The next step is to determine if the family or caregiver prefers to contact the PCP themselves or if they want your assistance. Your involvement may be beneficial for many reasons, but especially if the parents don't feel confident in their ability to explain the need for OT or to advocate. In this case, you would need to get an ROI signed. Sometimes just getting the right person, such as the PCP on the phone, is the most difficult part. However, Brittany described that persistence, positive communication, and tenacity are often very effective tools. Another option that avoids phone tag is to just go to the PCP appointment with the family. Once you're able to communicate or the caregiver is able to communicate with the PCP, you may want to make sure that you're describing the sensory-related behaviors that you have observed and emphasize how they're impacting the child's daily functioning. This is where that checklist that I made may be beneficial because it provides observable behaviors with sensory modulation language. It can be as simple as giving the checklist to the parents with behaviors that you or the teachers have observed highlighted, etc. And then finally, another piece of advice Brittany suggested is that once the family gets a referral for formal OT evaluation, that you go along with the family to the appointment if possible. This is often beneficial because many OT assessments and forms completed during an initial evaluation, especially for those younger children, involve parent interview, parent observation, etc. This can be very overwhelming for parents. Also, there may be some sensory-related behaviors that you have observed or their teachers in school have observed that the parents may not have observed. So again, because sensory modulation can be a difficult concept to understand, having someone present during the assessment who understands not only sensory modulation, but sensory related behaviors can be beneficial. So that's all I have for you guys. I want to thank you for your patience with this presentation being done virtually. I know it's probably not as entertaining, but hopefully still beneficial. If you have any questions, please feel free to reach out to me. Dr. Scott has my contact information, and I hope that you can find this information useful with all your clients, families, and your treatment planning. So thank you.